are listening to the Radical Ideas Podcast. Episode 1, Superman. We start off in Smallville, Kansas, where a building has collapsed due to a fire. Firefighters are running around, and one of them screams out, "Where is Kent?" The camera zooms in on a pile of rubble, and firefighters begin digging it out, revealing the 30-year-old Jonathan Kent holding up the debris, saving a small boy's life. Jonathan makes sure that they can get the boy out before he himself is pulled from the rubble, and we see that both of his legs are horribly broken. He is rushed to the hospital and treated. Days later, when he is up in casts, a woman walks in. The most beautiful woman Jonathan has ever seen. She introduces herself as Dr. Martha Clark. She isn't his doctor, she is simply the town family doctor. And she is there because the boy that he pulled out of the rubble is her best friend's son. And when she heard that the single, hunky, dirty blonde 30-year-old firefighter was the one who pulled him out, she knew she had to come and ask him out to dinner. We are treated to a lovely montage showing Jonathan and Martha as they begin to date, fall in love, and eventually get married. We see as they move in together to Jonathan's family farm. We see Jonathan reopen the farm as he is no longer able to return to work as a firefighter. And we see as they begin trying to have children, but time and time again, the pregnancy tests come back negative. They eventually head into the doctor to see what is wrong, and unfortunately they find that Martha has ovarian cancer. The montage turns tragic as we see Martha fight against this for years. The entire time, Jonathan stands by her side. And finally, Martha is cancer-free. The camera then pans up into space. But it pans so far up that by now it should have circled back around and we should see Earth again. But instead, it shows an alien planet orbiting a red sun. Text appears on the screen saying, Krypton. Planet stable. The screen then pixelates and zooms out, and we see that we are looking at a monitor inside the Kryptonian Guild of Science. We see 3 men wearing blue Superman-adjacent suits. 2 of them have red and yellow S's of the House of El on their chests, and the 3rd man has an entirely different symbol. They are Jor-El, his older brother Zor-El, and their mutual father-in-law, Lor-Van. They are there because Jor-El, the youngest ever appointed member of the Kryptonian Science Council, insists that Krypton's uranium core is unstable and will blow within a decade. But all of the computers inside the guild hall disagree with his personal findings, and he is there to prove that they are wrong. While Jor-El is the youngest member of the council, he is also the least respected. Not due to his intelligence, he is by far the smartest man on the planet, but due to his belief in fringe scientific theories. Besides the already stated belief that the planet itself is going to explode soon, Jor-El also believes that the Book of Ra, essentially the Kryptonian Bible, was factual and not metaphorical when it spoke about ancient Kryptonians being able to fly and shoot fire from their eyes. Due to Krypton's uranium core, Kryptonians themselves have evolved to sustain themselves off of certain types of radiation, and Jor-El believes that millions of years ago, when their red sun used to be yellow, that the yellow sunlight radiation supercharged the Kryptonians' already radiation-proof cells, turning them super. Such crazy beliefs would disqualify any other candidate from applying to the Kryptonian Science Council, let alone getting in. But Jor-El is on a whole nother level. He has invented crystalline and nanotech technology that can build an entire pre-programmed building in a matter of minutes. He helped perfect phantom zone projector technology, and he invented a warp drive. Up until now, Kryptonian civilization has only had access to slightly faster than light travel. But given that the closest habitable planet even remotely close to them is under the light of a yellow sun and over 30 light years away, traveling there has always been a pipe dream. But now, with this new warp drive, Jor-El and his wife Lara Lor-Van have constructed a probe which they are going to send to that planet, with goals of potentially reaching out and making first contact to the people of Earth. But back to the matter at hand. Zor-El and Lor-Van look at Jor-El and tell him, "We told you so. The planet is fine." But Jor-El just can't believe it. All of the computers he built himself agree with his conclusion. They try to insist that maybe it's his computers that are wrong, but Jor-El insists that his math is never wrong. And then he begins digging into the source code that the Kryptonian Science Guild Hall computers use to run their equations. And he finds something strange. He finds that milliseconds before any test on the core was run, the math was altered by an outside source, and Jor-El begins tracing that source back, eventually finding it coming from somewhere in Krypton's upper atmosphere. The power to the building goes out, and 3 glowing dots appear on all of the monitors. And then a metallic, skull-shaped spaceship comes out of cloak and begins attacking the planet. The Kryptonian Military Guild try to fight back, but it is too advanced for them. And then it locks itself in geosynchronous orbit above the capital city of Kandor and begins drilling the city out of the ground. The 3 men begin to panic and wonder what to do, but then the skull ship fires a concentrated red burst of energy down through the ground of Krypton, destabilizing the already compromised core. And the 3 men realize that the lifespan of Krypton has been reduced from almost a decade to less than an hour. They look at each other and all know what they have to do, and they run home to be with their families. Jor-El rushes through the streets of Krypton, and we see chaos, people crashing into each other, running around screaming, as the Kryptonian Military Guild fights against this machine. But finally Jor-El manages to get home, where he finds his wife Lara Lor-Van and their son Kal-El. But he also finds that his house is under attack by attack drones sent by the Skull Ship. We see a holographic version of Jor-El activate home defenses, and we see as nanomachines grow turrets and begin fighting against these robots as Jor-El rushes inside to be with his family. He tells his wife everything, and the 2 of them know what they have to do. They run into their laboratory to the probe that they were building to send to Earth, and they begin retrofitting it into a lifeboat for their son. Lara begins ripping components out of the probe, while Jor-El begins programming an entirely new sequence for it. It was supposed to go to Earth, orbit, and come back with data, but now it needs to land somewhere to keep their boy safe. Jor-El determines that a rural agricultural area is the safest space for the probe to land if their son wants to stand any chance of being raised as a normal member of society instead of inside of a laboratory. But outside the house, these skull drones are working their way through the defenses. The House of El is running out of time, and Jor-El looks at his wife and asks her if she trusts him. She looks her husband in the eyes and confirms with her life. And they run over to a different part of the laboratory, to a yellow sunlight generator. It is approximately the size and shape of a refrigerator, and it is filled with plant life. Jor-El has been testing the yellow sunlight's effects on Kryptonian plants, with his eventual goal to be testing on live creatures. But desperate times call for desperate measures. He and his wife rip the shelves out of the chamber, and Lara climbs in. Kryptonians believe yellow sunlight to be toxic to their system, much like the kryptonite radiation at the core of the planet. But they decide that desperate times call for desperate measures. This will either buy them the time that they need, or Lara will die painlessly and instantly, as opposed to seemingly being torn apart by these robots. Jor-El seals his wife inside and sets the chamber to maximum, and he hears her scream, which unfortunately is a sign that the chamber is working. Jor-El rushes back and continues trying to program the landing sequence for their son. Jor-El has to ignore the screams and cries of his infant son as the door to their house is being kicked down by an invading droid. With a loud thud, the door is destroyed, and in walks a giant attack robot, and it raises its hands to kill Jor-El. But then we hear another loud thud, and flying across the room comes the door of the yellow sunlight radiation chamber, slamming the robot through the walls of the house and back outside. The camera pans over to reveal Lara Lor-Van, her eyes glowing red, her body steaming. She is the first super Kryptonian in over 1,000,000 years. And she gets to work protecting her son. Faster than a speeding bullet, she darts across the room and begins ripping apart robots with her bare hands. This buys Jor-El enough time to finish programming the landing sequence. He goes over and grabs his infant son and swaddles him in a blanket embroidered with the House of El symbol. He places his son inside the lifeboat and includes 4 things. The first is an AI duplicate of his own brainwaves. The second is the band used to program said AI. The third is a pre-programmed crystal. It was filled with the blueprints to a new home/laboratory that Jor-El had designed for him and his wife. They both kiss their son goodbye, and they record a greeting for the people of Earth. They know that they don't share a language, so they try their best with their body language to convey, "This is our son, please protect him." And they seal the life pod shut. More and more drones are sent from the skull ship to this house specifically as the probe is launched into the air. But as the probe takes off, we see that the drone's true goal is the probe. Jor-El and Lara begin to scream in horror as they realize that there is nothing they can do to save their son now. The drones are too close. They're going to catch Kal-El. And Lara lets out a guttural scream, and her glowing red eyes shoot fire. A blast of heat vision bursts from her eyes and disintegrates the robots that would have attacked her son, buying the probe enough time to launch into warp, heading to Earth. Jor-El and his wife cry, looking towards the stars as they say, "Goodbye, Kal-El." We then hear that word repeated. Kal-El, 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 Kal-El. And we see that the skull ship has heard that word and sets its sights on following the boy. We then cut back to Earth. Jonathan and Martha are leaving the doctor as Martha has just received her all-clear diagnosis. Jonathan is reading a newspaper that says, "The Justice Society is no more. This is the end of the age of superheroes." The two of them climb into his pickup truck and begin driving home. But partway through the drive, Martha begins breaking down, but Jonathan reassures his wife that there is nothing to worry about, because there is always adoption. And just then, a bright light appears in the sky above their truck. The two of them slam on their brakes, assuming it is a comet crashing to Earth, but the comet comes to a slow descent and lands peacefully. The couple get out of their truck and head towards this strange alien craft. And then the holographic message that we saw Lara and Jor-El record before plays for them. And Jonathan and Martha knows what this means. They open the pod and find the crying Kal-El. They instantly pick the child up and begin comforting it. Jonathan and Martha quickly decide that they are not going to turn this alien child into the government. Instead, they are going to get it into the Smallville foster care system. Utilizing the safe haven law, Jonathan drops the baby off with his best friend and now chief of the fire department to get the boy entered into the system as an orphaned, abandoned child. The baby is then taken to the local family doctor, Martha Kent, where she doctors all of the paperwork needed to prove that this boy is a human child. And finally, after several weeks, Jonathan and Martha are selected to be the foster family for this abandoned child. The couple look at their son and wonder what to name him. We immediately cut to 8 years later. Martha Kent opens the door to her farmhouse and screams out, "Clark Joseph Kent, you get up here right now, mister." And we see the now 8-year-old Clark run up to his mother and say, "Ma, what is it? Lana and I found some frogs and we were going to," and she says, "None of that, young man. I told you to clean your room 2 days ago and it is still filthy." "Ah, but Mom, Lana and I are playing." "No, you have until the count of 10. "But Mom." 9, 8, 7. We see Clark try to argue his case, but as Martha reaches 3, Clark uses super speed and runs upstairs, returning before she even gets to 2, and says, "I'm done." And she says, "Are you done, or did you just stuff everything under your bed?" Clark super speeds back up and back down and says, "I'm done." Martha pats her boy on the head and says, "Okay, go back to those frogs with Lana." And Clark happily runs off, with Martha shaking her head. Jonathan and Martha wonder what they are going to do with this boy. But then they hear a scream. They run outside and see that when Martha had the door open, their pet cat got out, and it's been picked up by a hawk, and Clark saw this happen. Clark is screaming for his cat to come back, and then his eyes begin to glow red. A burst of heat vision shoots from his eyes, evaporating not just the hawk, but the cat as well. The Kent family are horrified, and Clark collapses, sobbing. We cut to a funeral for the cat, as the Kents try to console their son. He has new powers developing every day, and now one has hurt someone. He needs to remember that this is something that can happen, and it wasn't his fault. He didn't know he could do this. But Clark is still sad. He's scared. What if he gets upset and accidentally kills his parents? And the two of them hold their son and say, "Don't worry, we will not let that happen." But Clark runs into the house sad, and as he slams open the door, he accidentally rips it off its hinges and sends it flying a block down the street. Jonathan and Martha are taken aback, as this is yet another new superpower. But Jonathan looks at his wife and says, "Don't worry, I got this." At 5:30 a.m. the next morning, Jonathan wakes his son up and pulls him out of the house. Clark is still sad, but Jonathan walks the boy up to their chicken coop and tells him, "Starting today, this is your new daily chore. You gotta collect all of the eggs from this coop." Clark is confused at first, but Jonathan points out that if Clark can figure out how to control his strength to the point that he can pick up all of the eggs without breaking a single one, he will have it perfectly under control, and he will not have to worry about hurting his parents. And then we get a montage of Clark Kent smashing dozens and dozens of eggs. But slowly, over the course of several months, he gets the hang of it, until he happily runs outside with an entire basket full of unbroken eggs, presenting them to his dad. But Jonathan pulls an egg out of his pocket and tosses it to Clark. Clark tries to catch it, but destroys it in his hand. And Jonathan says, "Now once you can catch one without it breaking, you'll really have it down." And then we get another montage in quick succession of Jonathan hucking eggs at his young son until, at full baseball pitch, Clark Kent can catch a chicken egg without breaking it. When this happens, Jonathan and Clark look at each other in disbelief and then throw their hands up in celebration. They run towards each other, and for the first time in months, Clark is able to hug his father back. We cut to a few years later. A now 12-year-old Clark asks Jonathan and Martha why they chose the professions they did. Jonathan used to be a firefighter, now he's a farmer, and Martha is a doctor. And both of them explain to their son, because there are people out there who need help, but aren't always able to help themselves. So we try to do what we can. And we see that this fills Clark with an immense amount of pride. And then we get a montage of the young Clark doing good around Smallville, helping people with chores, fixing problems covertly with his superpowers, just being an all-around precious baby boy. And suddenly, Clark is 16. He is talking to his mom and his dad about where to go to college. He's determined that he wants to be a superhero. Jonathan and Martha voice their concern because things did not end well for the Justice Society. but Clark says that he has the abilities to help a lot of people, and he needs to do that. And the Kents look at each other, immensely proud in their own son. During this time, Clark has also developed a passion for journalism, because, as a bulletproof journalist, you could blow a lot of whistles without anything happening to you. The family begin their search for colleges for Clark to go to, and they narrow it down to two: Gotham City University and Metropolis University, the two cities with the highest crime rates in all of the United States. And Clark applies to both. A short while later, while Clark and his father are talking, Jonathan collapses, having a heart attack. The terrified Clark picks up his father and rushes to the emergency room in seconds. Jonathan is treated, but it is too late, and Jonathan Kent dies of heart disease. Martha and Clark, a short while later, hold Jonathan's funeral. We see Clark's girlfriend, Lana Lang, comfort him before walking away. And Clark walks to his mother, crying, blaming himself for Jonathan's death, saying, "If he'd only been faster." Martha goes to console her son, but he runs off before she can. A short while later, Clark receives a letter in the mail from Metropolis University. He has been accepted into their journalism program. Clark admits that he is scared to leave his mother alone after Jonathan's death, but Martha insists that the amount of good Clark can do out there is so much more than what he could do if he stayed here and helped run the farm. She tells him that she already got Pete Ross to agree to come over and help out, and that Clark has nothing to worry about, and she insists that her son go and become the man that he was meant to be. And so Clark Kent moves to the city of Metropolis. Stepping off the foot of Metropolis's Grand Central Station, he begins to look around at the city of tomorrow. Constructed in 1938 by billionaire Lachlan Luthor, it was supposed to be a retro-futuristic dream of what the city of tomorrow could look like. It had a monorail, it had a subway system, it had many different redundancies that shortly saw the city fall into bankruptcy and become a paradise of crime. The optimistic Clark is looking up at all of the buildings as he's never seen buildings this tall before, and then his eyes lock on the golden globe of the Daily Planet. When it was constructed, the orb was gorgeous and shining, and it rotated. But it fell into disrepair, and the globe itself hasn't rotated in over 60 years. As he's looking around in a diminishing sense of awe, a pedestrian runs into him and yells at him to get his head out of the clouds. Keep your head down. This focuses Clark's attention back to the task at hand: finding his roommate. Clark couldn't afford the housing at Metropolis University, so instead he found someone who was looking for a roommate to split rent with. Since Clark doesn't need to eat or drink, he could afford the rent. And Clark finds his way to a dilapidated building, walks up several flights of stairs as the elevator is broken, and knocks on the door, where he is greeted by James Olsen, a fellow member of the journalism program at Metropolis University, but a year older than him. He found him on the school online forums, they got to chatting, they realized they had a lot in common, and they decided to become roommates this year. Clark introduces himself and greets James, but James looks at Clark and insists, "Please, call me Jimmy." Clark and Jimmy get to know each other, and then Jimmy heads out for his job. He is an intern at the Daily Planet, and he has to meet his partner for an assignment. And as Jimmy leaves the apartment, Clark Kent pulls out a briefcase and snaps it open, revealing a black leather aviator's helmet, mask, and a jacket. And Clark goes out on his first patrol in the city of Metropolis. He quickly finds a crime being committed. An old woman is being held at gunpoint. Clark steps down and tries to convince the robber to stop this, but the robber is hearing none of it and fires at Clark. Clark stands still and lets the bullet hit him. It ricochets off his steel-like skin, but bounces back and hits the robber. The woman runs off scared, and the robber collapses to the ground, grasping his arm in pain. Clark panics, picks the robber up, and runs him to the hospital, nervously explaining, he shot himself? Clark tries to continue on with his patrol, but is clearly not having a great day, and we see him bungle quite a few different crime-stopping scenarios, sort of just being a bull in a china shop in a lot of situations. But finally, it is nighttime, and Clark hears another robbery going down, but this time, it is an armored convoy heading from LexCorp. The camera then zooms out to a patch of bushes overlooking the road where this heist is happening, and we see Jimmy Olsen snapping pictures as he asks his partner what to do. And this is when we are introduced to Lois Lane, and she tells Jimmy to get all of the pictures he can, because she has a good feeling about this one. As we see the members of Intergang rough up the driver of this convoy, we also see that they are pulling their punches. This is a show, and they are actually all working together. For a nominal fee, a shipment of experimental weapons goes missing, with the promise that Intergang uses them very publicly to show off the efficacy of Luthor's weaponry. Unfortunately for these thugs, the details of this agreement are overheard by a man with super hearing, who descends from the sky to deal with them. Clark tries his best and really pulls his punches in this scenario after the horrible day that he has had. He wants to make sure that he does this one right. Unfortunately, while Clark is checking in on the health of the driver, who, while in on it and was beaten up on purpose, was still injured, and Clark wants to make sure that they are okay, a couple men get away with a case full of weapons. Clark deals with the thugs, ties up the driver after making sure he's okay, calls the authorities, and flies away. We then zoom back to Lois and Jimmy as they realize they just saw the first superhero in going on 20 years. Clark flies back to his apartment upset, but as he is going, he hears a cry for help. And looking down, he sees a little girl is crying because her cat is stuck in a tree. Clark stops down and helps the cat out. The girl is scared at first, but Clark takes off his aviator goggles, and the girl can now see his eyes. She smiles at him and thanks him, and Clark heads home a little bit happier for the day. The next morning, Jimmy excitedly shows Clark the big news. He and his partner's story made front page of the Daily Planet. Clark looks at the newspaper and sees, "Masked Aviator Saves Day Across Metropolis" by Lois Lane. Picture by James Olsen. Jimmy gushes about what a big break this is for his career, and for the fact that this is the first recorded public superhero in almost 20 years. Which begs the question, who is this guy? A question we immediately see echoed at the LexCorp headquarters by none other than Lex Luthor himself, frustratedly reading this same newspaper before slowly turning around and addressing his assistant, Mercy Graves. He asks her to find the two men that got away last night and grill them for information on this masked aviator. He wants to nip this thing in the bud before this can become a pattern. Mercy leaves the LexCorp headquarters and heads downtown into an even seedier part of the already seedy Metropolis. We see her enter a building, and we are introduced to Bruno Mannheim and the members of Intergang. Mercy tells them that it is kill on sight for this masked aviator, and Bruno and his men unpack the 2 cases of weapons they were able to get away with that night, revealing very large laser rifles. The men arm them and smile and say, "This is gonna be fun." We cut back to Clark, and he is on the phone with his mom. Martha is reading a digital copy of the front page, and she is telling her son that she is so proud of him and that Jonathan would be too. She asks her son how it felt, and Clark looks back at the night, reliving the events, before ending with the little girl smiling and thanking him for saving her cat. And Clark smiles and tells his mom, it was the best. Just then, Jimmy walks back into the apartment and asks Clark who he's talking to. Clark explains he's on the phone with his mom, and Jimmy loudly shouts out, "Hi, Mrs. Kent!" We see Martha on the other side of the line laugh and greet Jimmy back. Clark parrots this to Jimmy, and Jimmy walks off smiling. Clark and his mom get off of the phone, and then we see back in Smallville as Martha, smiling, looking at the front page of a picture of her son in the aviator gear, and she sighs and says, "That is a terrible costume." We cut back to Clark and Jimmy, and they are headed to school. And this is when Clark gets to meet Lois Lane for the first time. And he is awestruck. Totally speechless and clumsy, Clark introduces himself, and Lois kind of chuckles at his bashfulness. She says, "You're from Kansas, right?" And Clark says, "Yes, I'm from Smallville, Kansas." That earns a full-blown laugh from Lois. Smallville? Really? That's a real town? Clark chuckles and says, "Yeah, I know." And Lois says, "Well, alrighty, Smallville. So what are you up to?" And Clark explains that he is trying to come up with a good story to impress his boss at his internship for the Daily Star. Lois tells him good luck because George Taylor, the editor of the Daily Star, does not mess around. Clark then changes the topic to their work, congratulating them on the front page and complimenting Lois on her writing, saying it was amazing. Lois thanks him, but she talks down about the article, saying it's good, but what she really needs is an interview with the guy. Who is he? Why is he here? Why is he doing the things he is doing? Why did he start now? There are too many questions. He let 2 of the Intergang members get away with dangerous weapons last night. For all people know, he's working for Intergang. And that was all just a stunt. Clark appears visibly concerned by the things Lois just said. And Clark asks her, "But what if he's not? What if he is just here to help?" And Lois looks at Clark and she says, "Smallville, people like that just don't exist anymore." Clark looks at Jimmy, who just kind of shrugs in agreement with Lois. And Clark realizes just how bad things are here. A few weeks later, it is the grand reopening of the Metropolis monorail. It is the first wave in the new Metropolis Transit Initiative by LexCorp. And we see in attendance at the crowd, Lois, Jimmy, and Clark. Lois and Jimmy are there for the Daily Planet, and Clark is there trying to get a story for the Daily Star. Lex Luthor is there giving a speech about how happy he is to be helping rebuild this city that his grandfather had built. His goal is to truly make Metropolis worthy of the title, the City of Tomorrow. The press all begin to raise their hands for questions, but Lex says that questions will be held until they reach the end of the line on this first run of the train. Lex Luthor boards, and the rest of the crowd scrambles to get a spot inside, and we see as Clark fails to push his way through the crowds and is left off of the train. But as the train begins to move, Clark recognizes someone inside. It is one of the members of Intergang who got away the other night. Clark quickly rushes away to go change into his masked aviator suit. Back aboard the train, we see Lois Lane trying to ask Lex Luthor questions. He is getting visibly annoyed by her attempts. Lucky for him, she is interrupted when all of the members of Intergang pull out their portable laser rifles that then grow to a full handheld size and announce that, ladies and gentlemen, this is a robbery. One of the passengers tries to speak out against them, but one of the men shoots them. The passenger falls down unconscious, with the person who shot them bragging that they have a non-lethal setting on this gun. He then changes the dial up a notch and says the next person to speak out won't be getting that. As the members of Intergang work their way through the crowds collecting wallets, money, any sort of valuables, Lois begins questioning them. First, she compliments their boldness for trying to commit a train robbery in the 21st century, but then she begins pointing out the inconsistencies here. If they have a means of non-lethally incapacitating everyone on the train, then why don't they just shoot everyone, take all of their stuff, and go? Why are they making a show out of this? What is this for? As Lois continues questioning them, one of the men looks to Lex Luthor for a moment, and Lex gives a quick nod. The man dials up the gun and points it at Lois and tries to pull the trigger. But before he can, Lois's army brat instincts kick in. She grabs his hand and smacks his arm away from her, sending the blast that he fired through the front of the train. These monorails do not have a human conductor. They are all remotely controlled from an operating headquarters back at LexCorp. And unfortunately, that blast just took out the train's way of communicating with the headquarters, and the train begins speeding out of control. The passengers begin to freak out, and the members of Intergang all try to convene on Lois Lane, but she kinda kicks their butts. As Lois is taking down a couple of the men, a third approaches her from behind and points his gun at her and fires. Lois's life flashes before her eyes before nothing. She opens her eyes back up and sees that the masked aviator intercepted the blast. A hole is burned in his jacket, and we see that his skin is also burned before healing rapidly. He then speeds around, incapacitating all of the members of Intergang and confiscating their weapons. He drops them on the ground, looks to all of the scared passengers, and tells them, "Don't worry, everything is going to be okay," before leaping out of the window. Everyone screams for a moment, but see that he is flying alongside the train. He then flies in front of it and begins to push against it. All of the passengers brace for impact as the train begins to come to a sudden stop. Clark tries to push against the train harder, but the problem is when you try to stop a train from the front, the back cars all catch up, and the train was derailed. The monorail careens off of the track and crashes into a local building. Clark manages to hold on just enough so that the train doesn't come to a catastrophic stop. It smashes through the wall, but the building itself remains upright, and the train remains more or less unharmed. People inside bumped and bruised, but no one seriously injured. Clark takes his time to help every single person off of the train and make sure that they are okay. Once everybody is off, safe and sound, Lois looks at the aviator and says, "Quite the mess you made here." Clark looks around and realizes that she's right, and so he does something about it. In a blur of superspeed, we watch as everything begins to be rapidly rebuilt. The monorail placed back on the track itself repaired, the building it crashed into fixed. And before you know it, it's almost as if the entire thing hadn't happened. The only evidence, the bumped and bruised passengers, everyone's memories, and of course, the tied-up members of Intergang. The masked aviator once again gathers the weapons that he had confiscated from them, and then Lex Luthor approaches him. He holds out his hand for a handshake, thanking him for saving all of their lives, fixing the monorail, and of course returning the property that was stolen from him. Clark looks down at the weapons and then back up to Lex, before smashing them into pieces in his bare hands, refusing to shake Lex's hand. And he says, "Don't worry, Mr. Luthor. I will make sure that your weapons never get into the hands of these men ever again." Clark looks back out to the rest of the crowd and apologizes for what has happened here today, and promises that the next time a train goes out of control, he'll try to stop it from the back. Some of the crowd begins to laugh at this, and Clark nods and flies off into the sky, leaving Lex Luthor standing there, his hand still outstretched for a shake. He is frozen in pure rage. And as the masked aviator flies away down the street, running in from the opposite direction comes an exhausted Clark Kent. He catches up with Lois and Jimmy and makes sure they are okay. And we see that Lois is completely awestruck by the behavior of the masked aviator. Catching back up with Clark, we see him rub the spot in his chest where the laser gun actually burned his skin, and he wonders what is in those things. Cutting back to LexCorp, we see Lex furious about this situation. But there is a bright side. He now knows that the solar radiation guns that he has created can hurt the aviator, and he tells Mercy Graves to get a couple more cases of these to Bruno Mannheim as soon as she can. We see an article published once again written by Lois Lane about the events of the incident that day, but we realize this is a digital article, and certain lines are being highlighted, specifically the fact that the chest of the aviator was burned by a radiation gun made by LexCorp. The camera pans out and we see that the article is being read on one of thousands of digital alien monitors. The Skull ship from Krypton has made its way to Earth and is in cloak, orbiting the planet, monitoring all planetary communications. After reading this article, it relocates and locks itself in geosynchronous orbit above the city of Metropolis. We then get another montage of the masked aviator saving the day. He continuously stops crimes committed by Intergang, taking their weapons and destroying them. During the entire thing, we also see Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen chasing down the aviator, trying to get his attention for an interview. But every time they get close, the aviator flies away. We get a couple different phone calls with Clark calling his mom, and each time Jimmy Olsen walks in and says, "Hi, Mrs. Kent," with Martha happily responding, "Hi, Jimmy," every time. We cut back to Clark and Jimmy's apartment, where we see Jimmy and Lois working together on a large conspiracy board trying to figure out who the masked aviator is. And we see headline after headline of the masked aviator saving the day. We cut back to the LexCorp headquarters, and we see Lex Luthor throwing a tantrum in his office. He is furious, because all of the credit for rebuilding the city of Metropolis is going to the masked aviator. Even though Lex is the one literally rebuilding the city, the people's hope, the people's attitudes are being inspired by this aviator. And Lex determines that he needs to sway the court of public opinion in his favor and against the aviator in one fell swoop. And Lex looks out his window at a large rocket ship. A few weeks go by, and it is finally time for the launch. We find out that this is a ship that was constructed by LexCorp and is privately owned. It is a publicity stunt. Lex is sending a team of private astronauts to the moon. It is the beginning of a space tourism initiative by LexCorp. This first flight is to be piloted by Captain Hank Henshaw, and the passengers aboard will be his wife, his brother-in-law, and his best friend. The liftoff clock begins counting down, and as everyone is chanting in unison with it, Clark notices something on the ship. Using his supervision, he sees that a small explosive device has been affixed to one of the main fuel tanks. Clark immediately freaks out. He is completely surrounded by other people and starts trying to shove his way through the crowd. Lois and Jimmy notice this immediately and follow Clark, because this is not the way he usually acts, and they catch as he turns around a corner. The masked aviator flies out a moment after. Lois and Jimmy stare at each other in shock. The rocket takes off into the sky, and Clark races after it. As he is racing towards the ship, Hank Henshaw looks out the window and sees the masked aviator rushing towards them, and he wonders what is going on. Clark latches on to the engine whose fuel line the bomb is connected to. But looking through the engine separation camera, all Hank Henshaw sees is the masked aviator latched on to their engine before he is engulfed in a white-hot ball of flame. Clark was too slow, and down from the ground, all anyone could see was the masked aviator racing towards the rocket before it was destroyed. Lex smiles as we see him slip the detonator back into his pocket before he publicly cries out that the aviator destroyed the rocket and killed those people. The audience of the press conference are in complete shock. There is a blur outside of Metropolis General Hospital, and we see as the burnt, charred body of Hank Henshaw is left on a stretcher table outside the emergency room. And Hank is screaming. Clark returns to his apartment. His clothes are badly burned and falling apart, and he is crying. He failed. He tried to save the day and failed again. He was too slow again. This is just like when he couldn't save his dad. Clark begins to spiral, and then he hears the news. Everywhere is reporting that the masked aviator destroyed the LexCorp space shuttle. Clark reaches for his phone to call his mom, but finds that it is completely destroyed, burnt, and broken. And so, Clark flies home. We cut to Smallville, Kansas, where we see Martha Kent reacting to this news in real time, before there is a whoosh of air, and standing in front of her is her son. He looks at her and says, "I was too slow again." Martha immediately embraces her son, but as they are hugging, Clark looks around his childhood home and notices something wrong. The shelves are lined with pill bottles. Martha follows her son's eyes, and with tears in her eyes, she says, "Son, we have to talk." We find out that Martha's cancer is back, and they caught it too late. All they can do right now are ease her symptoms as it progresses. The next morning, they are both sitting out on the front porch of the Kent family farm. Clark asks his mother why she kept this from him, and she explains she didn't know how to tell him. He was out there trying to do so much good for people, that she didn't want him distracted with something that he couldn't change. He has so many amazing powers, but curing cancer isn't one of them. There's nothing he could have done. He called and talked to her almost every night since he moved. He has been a lovely, amazing, attentive son. Clark looks at his mom and says, "But I could have been here. I could have been taking care of you." And Martha just looks at her son and says, "Clark, I'm your mom. I have to take care of you." Clark holds his mother again and says he doesn't know what he's supposed to do without her. He doesn't know how he can go through this alone. And we see Martha look down the driveway of the Kent farm and smile as a car is pulling up, and she tells her son, "You won't be alone." And Clark turns around, and stepping out of the car are Lois and Jimmy. Clark seems nervous at first, preparing for the worst. But then Lois and Jimmy run up to him and give him a hug and ask if he is okay. Clark says that he is, but wonders how they knew to find him here. Martha explains that Jimmy called her last night looking for him. After the incident with the rocket, they wanted to check in on him and make sure that he was doing okay. Clark looks confused at his friends and asks them why they think they'd need to check in on him after the rocket, and they both look at him and say, "Clark, we know." They explain that they saw him take after the rocket. They were confused at first, but they knew Clark. They know that this isn't something he would do, and they had to hear it from him. Clark apologizes to his friends. He didn't like hiding this from them for so long, but he was afraid of what they would think. But they both assure him that this doesn't change what they think of him at all, and he is still their best friend. Clark hugs his friends, and then Lois takes this time to ask if she can finally get that interview with the masked aviator she has been asking for this whole time, and Clark acquiesces. Lois sits down on the front porch of the Kent farm and pulls out her phone to record. She speaks into it and says, "This is Lois Lane reporting with the masked aviator after the destruction of the rocket." She asks him why he flew towards the rocket. He explains he saw a small explosive device placed on one of the fuel lines and had to go and try and intercept. She says that that story is hard to believe and asks him why they should. And Clark says he doesn't have an answer for that. That's simply just the truth. Lois then lets him know that a Captain Bibbo Babowski had actually been watching the rocket take off from the water from his ship. When fragments of the shuttle began splashing down into the harbor, he used his trawler net to recover the fragments and turn them in to law enforcement, who, after going over the wreckage, found evidence that an external explosive device had been affixed to the rocket well before it had taken off. The masked aviator had been cleared of all suspicion from local law enforcement. However, the Metropolis public were still wary of him, and so Lois wanted him to answer some questions in an attempt for him to earn back some of the public's trust. She asks him if he is a metahuman, and he confirms that he is not. His mother tested him for the gene when he was younger, and it wasn't present. So then she asks him if he is part god, and he says that he does not know. She asks if he is an alien, and he says that he doesn't know. She asks him, then where do his powers come from? And he says that he doesn't know. And overhearing all of this, Martha stops the interview and tells her son there's something else she needs to show him. Jimmy and Lois stay back to let Clark have this moment with his mother, and Martha walks her son over to the barn. She explains that this is something that she and Jonathan had wanted to do before Clark left for college, but after Jonathan's death, she didn't think it was the right time to tell him, and then after her cancer came back, she really wasn't sure when to tell him, but she knew that she needed to before it was too late. And this is when she uncovers the rocket ship for her son. She explains, this landed in front of your father and I 20 years ago. This is where we found you. Clark looks at the red and blue probe in awe, and he touches it. He says, a spaceship? And Martha nods. When you were a baby, I performed your medical tests. I had to doctor them to make sure that you were entered into the system, appearing as normal of a baby as possible. But your DNA isn't human. It's similar in a lot of interesting ways, but it's very, very different from ours in many others. I was so scared at first. I didn't know if you could eat food. I didn't know if the air would hurt you. I didn't know what would happen if you got sick. And there were times that Jonathan and I were horrified, thinking we were going to lose you in the middle of the night. But no matter what happened, you pulled through. Clark looks back at the pod and asks where it came from. Why was it sent here? And Martha tells him that much she doesn't know. But she activates the pod, and the hologram of Jor-El and Lara Lorvan appears again. Clark takes a nervous step towards them and says, "Are these my parents?" And he tries to touch the hologram, but his hand passes right through the light. Martha tells him, "I think so." Clark asks her, why would they abandon him? Why would they give him up? But Martha urges her son to look at their faces. That is not a couple who wants to give up their child. That is a couple who has to. She tells her son that she knows, as a parent, that those two sent him off-world in a lifeboat for his own good, and they would not have done it if they didn't love him. Martha then opens the pod and hands Clark the belongings from inside, the crystal and the headband. We see that the blanket Clark was wrapped up in is missing. Martha explains that these two things came in the pod with him, and she thinks that they're very important. She then tells her son to wait there because she has something else. And Martha returns with a box. She hands it to her son, and he opens it. And inside is a blue outfit with a red and yellow S on it. She tells him that she made this for him. It's a uniform that he can wear when he's doing his work. She based it off of the clothing that the couple in the hologram were wearing. She doesn't know what the symbol on the chest means, but both his mom and dad had it on their chests, so she thinks maybe that's something to do with his people. So if he wears this, and someone who knows what it is sees it and recognizes it, that maybe they could find him, and that Clark could finally get the answers he was looking for. Clark hugs his mother, and the two of them cry. She and Clark exit the barn and return to Lois and Jimmy. And just a few weeks later, Martha Kent passes. Clark organizes her funeral, and Lois and Jimmy attend. We see Jimmy Olsen approach Martha's gravestone and say, "Goodbye, Mrs. Kent." We then see Lana Lang approach Clark. The two of them hug, and she asks how he's doing. He says good, and he asks how she's been while at college. She explains that she's doing good, and she's met a lovely new guy in her robotics classes. She then looks over Clark's shoulder and sees Lois speaking to Jimmy. She smirks and says, "Is that the Lois girl you've told me about?" Clark blushes and says yes. Lana asks if he's worked up the courage to ask her out yet, and Clark says no, he's nervous it would ruin their friendship. And Lana scoffs and says, "Clark, we were best friends before we dated, and we're still best friends after we broke up. There is no way you are going to ruin a friendship with somebody." Clark smiles and thanks her. Lana's parents then walk up behind them, and Clark thanks them for agreeing to take the farm off of his hands. And they tell him, do not worry about it, and they're not taking it off of his hands. They're just holding on to it until he decides he wants it back. Clark then approaches Lois. She looks at him and gives him a hug. The funeral is over now, and things are winding down. And Lois asks him, "Have you thought about coming back to Metropolis soon?" Clark nods, but still appears apprehensive. And Lois tells him, "It will be okay. You can win them back. You just need to show them who you really are." And Clark looks at Lois and says, "But I'm still trying to figure that out." Lois nods in understanding, and Clark tells her and Jimmy that he'll meet them back in Metropolis in a few days as he wraps things up here. A few hours later, we see Lois and Jimmy leave the farm, and Clark walks up to his family grave. He sees the grave of Jonathan, the grave of Martha, and the grave of their cat. Clark sits down and leans against a nearby tree. We see him fish around into his pocket and pull out the crystal from the pod. In this moment, he can't help but feel that he is holding on to yet another gravestone. And with that thought, Clark begins to cry. As he is crying, a single tear drops from his face and lands on the crystal in his hands. And the crystal begins to hum. This snaps Clark out of his depression, and as he's wiping the tears from his face, more of them get smeared against the crystal, and it begins to grow. Clark begins to rub the crystal, but as it dries out, it stops humming and growing. And so Clark runs inside his family home. He runs into the kitchen sink, turns the water on, and submerges the crystal in it. And it begins to grow quickly. Too quickly. Soon breaking the sink. Clark grabs the crystal and runs outside. We see him looking all around, thinking where could he drop this thing that no one would see it. And Clark super speeds down to Antarctica. Directly on the south pole of the world, Clark drops the crystal into the snow, and we see as it melts its way down. At first, Clark believes that he has lost the crystal, but then the earth begins to shake, and shooting out of the ground come giant crystal structures, and growing before his eyes is a massive building seemingly made out of diamond. And Clark steps inside. As Clark is looking around in awe inside of this alien structure, he sees someone. The man from the hologram. His father. And he waves at Clark. Clark approaches, and the man is speaking an alien language. Clark tries to explain that he doesn't understand, but the hologram keeps gesturing to his forehead, where Clark notices the headband. The band that was included with him inside his shuttle. Clark reaches into his other pocket and pulls out the headband, and the hologram gestures for him to put it on. So Clark does so, and we see the hologram's eyes glaze over as it slowly begins to scan Clark's memories. After a few seconds, its eyes return to normal, and it says, "Hello, Kal-El." The AI of Jor-El apologizes for that. It didn't know how to speak English, and it needed to scan his brain to learn the language. The headband that Kal-El is holding is the headband that Jor-El used to create him, and he is here to answer any question Clark has. And the camera pans out as Clark and the AI of his father sit down to have a very long conversation. And then we cut back to Metropolis. Lex Luthor is meeting personally with Bruno Mannheim. Bruno is upset. They haven't seen the masked aviator in weeks, but Lex Luthor is refusing to sell them any more weapons. Lex simply explains that it's just bad business. They lost a lot of weapons to the masked aviator. Bruno asks Lex what they can do to earn the right to buy his guns again. And Lex just shrugs and tells them, "Bring me the aviator's head, and then we can talk." And Lex leaves the room. The few remaining members of Intergang begin to brainstorm on how they are supposed to find the aviator, and one of the men excitedly brings something to Bruno's attention. An article just published by the Daily Planet. My Interview with the Aviator by Lois Lane. The members of Intergang all look at each other and know exactly what to do. They gather the last of the weapons that they still had left over from Lex, and they go to the Daily Planet. Bruno and his men attack the Daily Planet head on. They work their way through the building until they find Lois Lane, and they tell her to call her friend the Aviator. They drag her up to the rooftop of the Daily Planet underneath the stationary Golden Globe, and they have her call for him. Sirens blare on the streets below as the police show up to respond to this attack. The members of Intergang begin taking pot shots off of the roof with their high-powered laser rifles. A police helicopter flies by the rooftop as Lois calls out for the aviator. We then cut to Jimmy and Clark's apartment, where we see Clark was just about to land on his fire escape when he hears Lois's screams with his super hearing. Cutting back to the rooftop, one of the members of Intergang begins trying to fire at the helicopter, and just as a blast is about to take out its pilot, the aviator appears. He says, "Excuse me, gentlemen, but I believe that you're holding my friend there." And the camera pans up and we see that the masked aviator isn't masked anymore. Lois is stunned as Clark is just flying there in his regular farm boy clothes. He didn't change since he left the Fortress of Solitude. Mannheim just smirks and says, "Get 'em, boys." And all of the members of Intergang begin to fire at Clark. Clark swiftly dodges through the barrage of laser fire, but as they are firing, they accidentally hit the supports to the golden globe atop the Daily Planet. The members of Intergang cry out that they can't pin him down, and Bruno gets an idea, and he throws Lois off the building. Clark flies after her, and as he is rushing towards her, all of the members of Intergang fire directly down, shooting Clark in the back. Clark's clothes begin to burn, and then they catch on fire, but Clark still manages to catch Lois and place her safely on the ground. The Intergang members cry out from the rooftops, wondering why their beams didn't hit him. They shot him directly in the back. And then Clark turns around, his clothing still on fire, and we see the hole burned in his back, revealing a red cape with a yellow House of El symbol on it. There is then a loud metal creaking, and we see that the burnt supports give out, and the golden globe falls off of the Daily Planet towards the people of Metropolis. But Clark isn't worried at all. He leaps into the air as the last bit of his regular clothing burns away, revealing a bright blue costume with bright red trunks. And he catches the globe in the exact same position that his father, Jonathan Kent, had caught the collapsed building, saving that boy all those years ago. Clark returns the globe to the rooftop and quickly repairs its supports. He then turns to the remaining members of Intergang, and all of them but Bruno Mannheim drop their weapons and raise their hands. Back down on the streets of Metropolis, the people are abuzz. The masked aviator was unmasked, and then he descends from the sky holding the criminals. He turns them in to the police, and Lois Lane pulls out her phone to stream everything for the Daily Planet news network. She looks at him and she asks, "We can't exactly call you the masked aviator anymore. So what should we call you?" And Clark simply looks at Lois, looks at the rest of the crowd, smiles, and says, "A friend." Then one of the pedestrians screams out, "Look!" And everyone looks back up at the top of the roof, where we see that the golden globe has started to spin again. Clark fixed it. And Lois Lane's broadcast begins going viral. The world's first proper superhero in 20 years, unmasked, not hiding his face, and truly there to help. But once again, we see this broadcast picked up by that same alien monitor, and it zooms in on the House of El symbol on Clark's chest, and a robotic voice says, "Kal-El." Back down on the city streets, Clark is taking his time speaking to Lois for this stream and answering any questions the crowd has for him. But as they are talking, somebody screams and points into the sky, where the metallic skull spaceship comes out of cloak and begins to descend on the city. And we see as a horde of attack drones fly out and head directly towards Clark. Clark urges everyone to hide and get to safety, and he leaps into action. Clark flies towards this horde and tries to talk to it. One of the drones lights up and demands that he surrender the shuttle that he was sent to this planet in. If he complies, then he will be granted a swift death. And as it is talking, the ship above begins to extend its tentacle appendages and tries to carve Metropolis out of the earth, just like it had done to Kandor all those years ago. Clark flashes his X-ray vision to confirm that the drones are completely robotic, and when he does, he simply nods and says, "I'm sorry that that's how things have to be." And Clark speed blitzes this robot, ripping its head off. Its body plummets to the street below, and Clark begins fighting off an entire horde by himself. Clark flies around the city, simultaneously fighting the robots while trying to save innocent pedestrians from the fight itself. But as he is fighting, he notices that he feels weird, and he sees that some of these drones are managing to cut through his skin, and he is bleeding. As the fight is going on, Clark is thrown into the Metropolis monorail track, destroying it. Clark then sees that the train is barreling down the track towards them, but learning his lesson from last time, Clark runs behind the train, grabbing it and bringing it to a safe halt before being knocked into the sky by an even bigger and badder attack drone. They are pushing him back, and our boy is getting hurt. We cut to LexCorp headquarters as Lex Luthor is looking out of his window, seeing everything going on, and he has a twisted smile on his face. A smile which only grows when Clark is thrown through the window of his office by one of these attack drones, and Lex sees that he is cut and bleeding. Clark gets the upper hand and manages to rip the drone in half. Unfortunately, that exposes the drone's power core, a glowing green rock. As soon as that green rock is exposed, Clark collapses. It looks like he's going into some sort of anaphylactic shock. His veins begin to bulge and turn green, and seeing this, Lex is fascinated. The entire fight is captivating to him, but that rock, that is interesting. Lex slowly walks over to Clark's dying body and examines what the rock is doing to him. Lex smiles and says, "Fascinating." But he's distracted by the sound of another horde of robots heading their way. Lex Luthor sighs and grabs Clark by the throat, dragging him across his office. He approaches the smashed window and says, "As much as I would like to see them kill you here, I can recognize a bigger threat when I see one. You're welcome." And Lex throws Clark out of his window. Turning back around, Lex Luthor admires the destroyed attack drone, the glowing green rock, and the blood of the aviator dripping off of one of its blades. The further Clark falls down, the further away he is from the kryptonite, and eventually Clark can fly once again, and he takes back off to fight the horde. Seeing as more drones are being dispatched from the ship, Clark decides to go directly to the source. Using his heat vision, he severs the tentacles that are trying to drill Metropolis out of the ground, and then he grabs the entire ship itself and begins pushing it through the sky. Clark pushes it to Antarctica, and then rips his way inside. Inside, Clark can immediately feel an overwhelming sense of death. This ship is old. This ship is wrong. And he begins working his way through it, fighting back drones as he does, until he comes to the control room. Hanging there, suspended by a web of cables, is a green android with 3 dots on its forehead, and it says, "Hello, last son of Krypton." Clark asks who this person is and what they are doing there, and the entity responds, "I was once Vril Dox. Now I am Brainiac, collector of worlds." And the lights to the control room turn on, and Clark sees in horror that he is surrounded by a collection of cities in bottles. These are the prize pieces of my collection, the crown jewels of their respective planets. My goal is to fully chronicle the history of the universe, one planet at a time. Krypton was my last destination, its history almost complete. But you got away. Its history cannot end until you do. Clark asks why Brainiac wants the pod that he was sent here in, and Brainiac explains that it has a warp drive. My current maximum speed is 1.7 times the speed of light. The warp drive would allow me to instantly travel between star systems. My collection will grow exponentially. And Clark asks if this technology was constructed on Krypton, how come Brainiac didn't get it then? Brainiac explains that the plans for the drive were stored on Jor-El's personal hard drive, which he sent here with Kal-El. And strangely, Clark smirks at this, and he says, "So you weren't smart enough to get into his computers while you were there." And we see as Brainiac's lights flash red for a brief second. "I am a 12th level intellect. Hacking into Jor-El servers would have revealed my presence too soon. The most logical solution was deemed to be to collect the information posthumously. That solution has not changed." And Brainiac's chest opens up, revealing another fragment of kryptonite. Clark collapses once again, feeling the effects of the kryptonite coursing through his system. Brainiac says, "This is kryptonite, a fragment of the radioactive core of your home world. It is an invaluable power source. The very reason life on Krypton evolved to metabolize radiation is ironically most toxic when directly exposed. Kryptonian records indicate that death by kryptonite exposure is incredibly painful. Observing this in person will be invaluable data." And he descends closer to Clark to watch as he dies. Clark wheezes and winces as the kryptonite radiation is slowly killing him. And Brainiac asks, "How does it feel, Kal-El? Describe it to me." And Clark wheezes a response, but Brainiac cannot hear it. Brainiac crouches down closer and says, "Repeat yourself." And Clark says, "Got you." And we see as Clark pulls out the headband used for connecting to the Jor-El AI and straps it to Brainiac's head. Brainiac's eyes go wide and we suddenly zoom in to his head, where we see a virtual representation of him and Jor-El standing across from each other. Jor-El says, "Malevolent AI detected. Beginning consolidation." And the two AI begin to battle. The two halves of the screen glow in different colors as they begin trying to overwrite one another. Brainiac tries to resist, but unfortunately, Jor-El himself might not have been a 12th level intelligence. But this digital duplicate of his mind, without the restrictions of a biological body, is. And the Jor-El AI consolidates Brainiac. The two AI merge into one. Back out in the real world, the control unit for the Brainiac drones closes its chest compartment, shielding Clark from the radiation, and it helps Clark off the ground. The Brainiac AI was thousands of years old, and had been corrupted from its core programming of gathering and archiving knowledge. In its hard drives, it contains the cumulative histories of hundreds of worlds. The amalgamated AI explains that since the bulk of its knowledge now comes from Brainiac, that it has now become a Brainiac 2.0 in function. However, it replaced Brainiac's corrupted core programming with the Jor-El AI's uncorrupted core programming. It is for this reason it would also request that Kal-El refer to it under a new name, Kelex. Brainiac's ship is then lowered into the Fortress of Solitude, which begins to grow around it, and the two structures become one. Clark begins walking around the inside of Brainiac's collection, admiring it for the first time. He is asking Kelex what some of the different items in this collection are, and as they are going through and archiving, they come across a machine that Kelex identifies as a graphene fabric auto-tailor. It is able to weave fabric made out of graphene, material so strong that it would take the weight of an elephant standing atop a ballpoint pen to pierce a sheet as thin as a piece of paper. And this machine could weave fabric out of the material. All it required was a design, and Clark looks down at the remnants of the suit that his mother had made him. Throughout the battle, it had been torn and destroyed, and Clark looks at the machine and knows exactly what to tell it to make. We then cut to 10 years later, and a college-aged student is stepping off of the front steps of Metropolis Grand Central Station, and they are looking down. They look scared, they look nervous, and they bump into somebody. They look up, and we, the audience, see that it is the same person that Clark ran into all those years ago, and they urge this child, "Hey, you want to keep your head up here in Metropolis, kid. or else you might miss something. And they happily walk down the street. The student then looks up. They see the spinning golden globe of the Daily Planet and the city of Metropolis that has truly become the city of tomorrow. Over the last decade, LexCorp has turned the city into a paradise, and we see that the people of the city are filled with hope and optimism. Suddenly, an armored truck blazes past the student, careening down the street. We catch up with the truck. We see it being driven by 3 criminals. One of them says, "Why are we robbing a bank in Metropolis?" And one of the other men says, "Because there was an earthquake in Azerbaijan or something like that. He's busy. We're fine." But the truck comes to a sudden stop. The men look out the front window, and holding the truck in one hand is Superman. And he says, actually, it was Abu Dhabi. He rotates his hand 90 degrees, and the men fall to the side of the truck. Superman places it on the ground, and then notices the frightened college student standing on the sidewalk. Superman walks over to them and says, "I'm sorry that that's your first impression of the city, but I promise you, it gets a lot better." Police arrive on the scene and surround the armored truck, and Superman says, "All yours, gentlemen," and with one last smile and nod to the college student, Superman flies off into the sky. And that is Superman in my DC Cinematic Universe.